Great, thank you. So let's start. I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. My name is Uwe Brandes. I'm Professor of Practice and Faculty Director of the Global Cities Initiative. And I'd like to extend a very special welcome to all of our speakers. They'll be introduced in a few minutes. The Global Cities Initiative is a interdisciplinary dialogue that includes all schools and all disciplines at Georgetown University in support of learning more, disseminating information about one of the most important trends in the 21st century, and that is global urbanization. We have a website, and we encourage anyone who is not on our mailing list to join our mailing list, where you can learn about more events such as this one here today. It is of great excitement that we have partnered with the Georgetown Humanities Initiative on this event. And I'm extremely excited to introduce Professor Nicoletta Preddu, who is professor in the Italian department and founding faculty director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. I'd like to turn it over to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank you and the Global Cities Initiative for offering to co-organize this event with the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. Georgetown Humanities promotes interdisciplinary collaborations across departments for research, pedagogy, and public-facing projects that demonstrate the enduring value of the humanities for the understanding of the human condition. In line with the integrative and inclusive educational mission of our university, we support both the traditional humanistic scholarship and digital work, initiatives for the wider community, as well as arts and performances that engage with the critical issues of our time: racial and social justice, climate and the environment, migration, to name just a few. With their comprehensive, holistic approach, the humanities offer creative and critical tools to tackle complex problems. Through narratives, through stories, they address the differences that can drive us apart, but also the constructive power of diversity to bring us together, promoting ethical decision-making. For this reason, I would say the humanities are transformative. Well, already in its title, tonight's event highlights three fundamental and interrelated components that synthesize the role of the humanities in creating connections and in educating to values. And they are narrative, community, and change. So I very much look forward to this discussion, and I am now delighted to give the floor to Enrique Pelaez, master's candidate in the Urban and Regional Planning Program and student research fellow in the Global Cities Initiative. He will introduce our guests and share some details about the structure of the event. Thank you very much. Enrique, you have the floor.
Thank you. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's speakers. Angela Glover Blackwell is founder in residence at PolicyLink. She started the organization in 1999 with a mission of advancing racial and economic equity for all. Through her writing, speaking, and leadership, she helped grow and define a national equity movement focused on innovating and improving public policy with a wide range of partners to ensure access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color. Her work focused on the areas of building an equitable economy, health, housing, transportation, infrastructure, and arts and culture. Prior to founding PolicyLink, Ms. Glover Blackwell served as Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation. A lawyer by training, she gained national recognition as founder of the Oakland California Urban Strategies Council, where she pioneered new approaches to neighborhood revitalization. She's the creator and host of the recently launched podcast, Radical Imagination. Ms. Glover Blackwell is the author of numerous publications and the recipient of too many awards to mention here. She serves on many boards, including serving as chairperson of the Children's Defense Fund, and she is a member of the Community Advisory Council for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. During this academic year, she is serving as visiting fellow to the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. Ms. Glover Blackwell earned her bachelor's degree from Howard University, a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Sherry Linkon is professor of English and American Studies and faculty director of the Writing Curriculum Initiatives. She's affiliated faculty with the Kalmanowitz Initiative for the Labor and the Working Poor. Her research and teaching have long emphasized interdisciplinary approaches to the study of culture, often rooted in literary, artistic, and media representations. She was one of the founders of Working Class Studies, and much of her research has focused on deindustrialization. Her most recent book, The Half-Life of Deindustrialization, Working Class Writing about Economic Restructuring, examines contemporary American working class literature and media. With John Russo, she wrote Steeltown, USA, Work and Memory in Youngstown, a study of representations of work and place in the northeastern Ohio Steel City. Along with her academic work, she writes for public audiences, including a weekly blog, Working Class Perspectives. She has a doctorate in American Studies from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree from University of Denver. Jordan Sand is professor in the Department of History and in the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture. He teaches modern Japanese history and other topics in East Asian history, as well as urban history and the world history of food. His research and writing have focused on architecture, urbanism, material culture, and the history of everyday life. Professor Sand is the author of House and Home in Modern Japan, which explores the ways that westernizing reformers reinvented Japanese domestic space and family life during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he also authored Tokyo Vernacular, Common Spaces, Local Histories, Found Objects, which analyzes problems of history and memory in the post-industrial city. He has also written on the comparative history of urban fires and firefighting, the history of Japanese food, the study of cultural heritage and museums. He has a doctorate in history from Columbia University and master's degree in architecture from the University of Tokyo. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Glover Blackwell to deliver her remarks.
Thank you, Enrique. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this really important issue of narrative in the context of community-based change. Everybody's talking about narrative right now, and it's a real pleasure and uplifting to see that people understand that the nation of the United States is really, the future is dependent on the story that we end up telling ourselves about the country. The thing that's brought it about, of course, has been COVID. COVID has brought so much about, but one of the things that has just been so crucial is the disproportionate impact that it has had on people of color in terms of health, in terms of the economy. That combined with the murder of George Floyd and the attention on the systems that have kept so many people down and have rendered so many people particularly vulnerable in this time has really brought us into a very full, in fact, the fullest that I have seen in my lifetime, a very full discussion about race. The election also contributed to this focus about needing to tell ourselves a story that prepares us for the future. The notion of some people thinking that we need to go back and other people knowing that we only ever go forward. The question is, how do we go forward? We actually find ourselves in a time where a huge portion of the country is being nostalgic for a time that never was and ignoring the future that is inevitable. We really are now experiencing a multiracial democracy, and we need a story to go along with it. We need a story that helps us to understand the power that could be in a multiracial democracy. So narrative is on everybody's mind. Some people trying to hold on to an old one, while others are trying to invent the next one. I really got introduced to narrative and telling the story of my own growing up in the context of work that I was doing around community building. I kept talking to people about community building in the 90s, and we were trying to give it a shape. And I realized that my own story helped me to have a better handle on it. I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. And I tell people that my growing up in St. Louis was the most integrated experience I have ever had in my life, even though I grew up in an all-Black community. I grew up in an all-Black community because of redlining, because of racism, because the only homes that were available to families were in the Black community, and the Black community was vast. The church was Black, the schools were Black, our social lives were Black. A lot of our shopping was also with other Black businesses. So how could that be my most integrated experience? Because it was economically integrated. I tell people I grew up in the most integrated environment I ever have because all of the community lived there. We all went to the same institutions. We had a deep connection. As I began to tell that story, always in a positive way, what it meant to grow up in a community in which all of the adults in my community were obsessed with protecting these Black children from the sting and burn of racism, a community in which everything seemed to be open to us because everybody had extraordinary expectations and aspirations for what we could do. I'm a child of the civil rights movement. I mean, I grew up hearing about it, pretending that we were in it, playing around resistance and what that meant to march. It was my life. Everything was possible. It made a real impression on me when I had my mother who sent me from St. Louis. I was living in Oakland, California at the time. A story about a woman who had grown up across the street from me, but at a different time, 15 years after. And she described that same community that I held so dear as being nurturing as apartheid. That's the way she experienced it, because by the time she was growing up, lots of things had happened to destroy that sense of community, to disinvest in the place where I lived, that the Black middle class, which had served as a buffer and a conduit to opportunity, had moved to the suburbs, moved to other parts of the city, leaving those who were poor and Black to fend for themselves with a system that was designed to keep them down. I learned about narrative then. And then I really wanted to think about how to apply what I had experienced and the change that I could observe had happened to the work that I was doing. That work was with the Urban Strategies Council. I started the Urban Strategies Council in 1987 to really focus on persistent urban poverty in one geographic area, Oakland, California, and to develop practices and policies that would create vast opportunity for everybody who lived there. As we started to do our work, we recognized that what we were doing, which was lifting up the voices of the people who lived in community, particularly those who had been most marginalized and discriminated against and targeted for oppression, that we were trying to tell a different story about possibilities. We were trying to align the public school system, the health system, the housing system, the policing systems with the aspirations of these families and these individuals. And we were finding best practice from across the country and curating it to show Oakland that this is what we could do and how do we align our policy platform. We realized that what we were doing was rebuilding the fabric of community and aligning institutions with the aspirations of the people who made up community. And that in order to do that, we had to talk to the people who lived there and lift up their stories. And in lifting up their stories about their needs for their children and their aspirations for their children, lifting up the stories about the disinvestment that had happened in their community, lifting up stories of elderly people who were lamenting that their children didn't want to live in their communities and something was happening there that made them feel that what they had spent their lives building was being torn apart and forgotten. in lifting up those stories and combining them with the stories of people who lived outside of Black and Latinx communities, but loved Oakland. There's something about connection to place that is sometimes as strong as connection to family, but it is family and growing up and achieving and thinking back. It's all bound up together. It's so hard for people to separate their story from the stories of the places that meant so much to them. And so we began very consciously to recognize that the stories and the narratives were part of what we had to build up as we were building up our policy agenda. And so now we find that this has become rather routine, that as we try to think about how to be able to align systems with the outcomes that we strive for, that it is important for us to help people to understand the history of those systems. That this is most obvious for most people when we think about police, because usually when we're thinking about systems and their history, it's only the people who are impacted by those systems who think about it. That if you haven't been a recipient of welfare, you don't have a lot of occasion to think about the welfare system. If you don't have children in the public schools, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about public school systems. It's the people who are impacted who are mostly can understand what's just, what's not just, what works, what doesn't work. But as a nation, we are focused in the United States on police because it's been brought into such sharp relief. But as we think about what we want from police, we have had to go back to the history. And understanding the history of police takes you into a narrative about contain and control. And understanding the stories of containing and controlling. After all, police began in the South to catch runaway slaves. The police built up in the Northeast to tap down the interest of labor. And we all have heard the stories of what the Texas Rangers were doing. It's so important to go back and understand that history as we think about how do we reshape police? How do we get community safety front and center? Some people think we have to abolish it. Many people think we have to completely change the funding. But we have to get everybody telling a different story about community safety and find out the place, if any, for police within that context. And to find the people who are in policing and the people who are in communities that feel threatened and people in communities that seek safety to come together and develop a narrative about broad community safety across Chicago, across New York, across Minneapolis and Miami and Oakland, California, will inform local policy, but it will inform national policy as well. PolicyLink is in partnership with two organizations right now, using narrative to address another one of our fundamental issues, and that is housing. We have a housing crisis in this country that is very troublesome. We're becoming a renter nation, and most people who rent, the majority of people who rent, are paying more than 30% of their income for renting. That's called being rent burden. And as people are trying to figure out how to find decent, affordable housing, many communities are concerned that the only affordable housing is in their communities. And for the improvements that they have always wanted to happen, it appears that they are being pushed out as others with more political clout and power come in and start demanding more safety, more services like grocery stores, the gentrification problem. We also have problems in terms of how to be able to solve the extraordinary homeless problem that we're seeing all across the nation. Well, Race Forward, Community Change, and PolicyLink have come together to launch the Housing Narrative Justice Initiative, which is working across the country in local community to begin to, from the bottom up, develop a new narrative about housing justice, right to housing, homes for all, begin to get people not thinking of housing only as something that developers can make money off of, not only as the source of wealth building, but housing as a human right. to begin to understand that the gentrification problem and the homelessness problem and all of these problems come out of us having made housing a commodity as opposed to something essential for decent living. Another effort that's starting underway is solidarity economics, where some of my colleagues are trying to develop an economy that puts people first, and how to be able to tell the story of the restaurant workers, many of whom are getting minimum wages, $2.13 an hour. What does that mean? That is not an economy that's working for all. How do we actually get the One Fair Wage Initiative to be part of what we all are leaning into as we think about the economy that we need going forward? So as I think about this issue of narrative, I am really drawn to the connection between the stories that we tell ourselves about the places that we live are a reflection of the lives of the individuals who live there. And there are so many different and conflicting stories. But when we keep peeling that onion, getting to the core, there are some things that we have in common. I often think of it as the uncommon common ground, not finding the lowest common denominator, but looking for the highest points of agreement where we can begin to tell a story that is fully inclusive and leaning into the future. I think that this country is poised for greatness, but only if it sees the changing demographics as assets that have to be captured and invested in to be able to realize the full potential. A multicultural democracy, a multiracial democracy, I meant to say, is a big idea. It is a new thing. It's something that we haven't really had. Beginning to tell a story about how that is going to change the trajectory for the future is the thing that we really need to work on. And we've got to go to the place and see how people see themselves in the context of place to find the fodder that narrative is going to need to be as powerful as it has the potential to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for these really inspiring and encouraging comments. I want to respond to this by highlighting some things that were completely present in everything Angela said, but I want to tease them out a little bit more and draw our attention to a couple of themes that I think are important about stories, starting with the idea that we sometimes think of stories as frivolous, as occasionally the humanities gets a bad rep for being, interested in kind of airy things. And I really want to dig into the idea that stories are really the meat that we build with. And it's, anybody who does community organizing knows that the thing you start with when you want to try to address a problem is the stories that people tell about that. But it's also true that stories capture, facilitate, embody, and hold some tensions that I think it's really important for us to understand about how societies work, how communities work. So let me identify a couple of the tensions that I think run through all of this. One is about scale. We tell our individual stories. Where did I come from? How did I grow up? When did I move to this community? What was my problem with housing? What was my problem with transportation? What was my problem with finding a job? And that can feel very individual, but of course, when we connect those stories, we help to build solidarity within groups. And people who share similar backgrounds, who grew up in the same neighborhood, who are of the same age, of the same race, the same gender, all of the different categories we talk about, may very well find that they have shared experience. I began my career as somebody studying women's studies. So the whole idea of consciousness raising, going back to the 1970s, where women shared stories and gained power because of that, is a good illustration of this. But stories also help to shape us on the level of community and whole cities. The part of what John Russo and I have written about as we've looked at Youngstown is the stories that got told about that city, some coming from the ground up and some coming from outside, and the power that those had. And then I think, and Angela, I love you gestured to this at the end in a very powerful way, the stories we tell about ourselves as individuals, about the groups that we belong to, about the cities and communities that we're part of, are also stories that help to shape us nationally and globally. And so all of those different scales, I think, are at work when we think about stories. Another piece of storytelling that I think is really important for us to play with and to think critically about is the relationship between past, present, and future. At the end of the book that John Russo and I wrote about Youngstown, Steeltown, USA, we conclude by saying that Youngstown had a problem with memory, that this community that had a lot of investment in a kind of romantic vision of its past had also very conveniently erased from the story of the city a history of class and racial conflict. And that if we didn't come to terms with those parts of what had shaped that community, we weren't going to be able to solve the problems. 15 years later, when I wrote my book about working class literature, I started by talking about how people in deindustrialized communities get used to being told that they should just get over it. They should stop thinking about the past. The past is done. Focus on the future. Think about what is possible. Part of what I've learned in all of that work is that you can't look at the future without understanding the past. And where we are in the present can help you see things in the past that you didn't recognize were there before. So we have to think about the value of the stories we tell about where we came from, about what we experienced in some previous time. We have to be able to capture what's going on now. And both of those things can help prepare us to imagine a story for the future. The last thing I think is really important to emphasize when we think about stories is a tension that is almost built in between stories as connecting points. You know, we think of storytelling as a kind of warm and fuzzy, lovely, connective tissue sort of thing, and stories as opportunities to recognize and deal with conflict. That stories are often places where we work through and we share and we make visible, we make usable a past that includes injuries, oppression, struggle, discrimination, divisions that are not necessarily easy to overcome. And if we want to create that kind of multicultural democracy, if we want to build cities where people can work together to solve problems, we can't tell stories that erase the divisions of our past. We have to be able to tell stories that help us understand the divisions of the past and begin to make it possible for us to do something with them so that we can change them and tell a different story in the future. So I think as we think about these stories and how stories translate into larger narratives, we need to pay attention to all of these complications of storytelling. I think if we do that, we're better positioned to use stories to create good narratives, to create change, to build the future that we want.
Thank you, both of you, for very provocative and vivid remarks. I'm going to take us to another part of the world for a moment, to Tokyo, which is my second home. But there are so many things in common around the world. Listening to Angela describing the community she grew up in, which was really just came to life before my eyes. I thought actually how important it is to hold on to that. I mean, I felt nostalgic, even though I didn't grow up in Angela's neighborhood in St. Louis. And yet it's really important to hold on to those things that do inspire a feeling of nostalgia, because those, you know, we need to be critics of the past as well. But those moments when community was really working for us provide, you know, that's a sort of a treasury of insights for our present and our future. So I was listening to that and thinking about experiencing that in Tokyo myself, because even as obviously a non-native, because when Angela was starting, I guess, or building the Urban Strategies Council in the late 1980s in Oakland, I was an architecture student in Tokyo, and found myself in a neighborhood just by accident of geography close to the university that was sort of a backwater, kind of a marginalized place. There weren't ethnic or racial issues about it, and there was rich and poor, or not rich, but anyway, well-to-do middle class and poorer parts of the neighborhood. but it was kind of a marginalized and forgotten place. And I arrived in it just as a group, actually 3 young women, had just started a magazine for the neighborhood. And the magazine was sort of starting to make this place a place again. And it was a very interesting process to watch and have a small role in, because they went around interviewing people they didn't know, something that I'm sure Sherry has done and that many anthropologists do, but this was their own neighborhood. And they were going around and really doing oral history and building what I call a vernacular historiography. This place didn't have a written history, and they went and they listened to people and they started making that written history in a little quarterly magazine. You had to buy it. It was not free, and I think that's actually important, but it was also very homespun, and it only sold in little local stores and so forth. And bit by bit, collecting people's stories. And of course, the stories were there, and many of them perhaps were nostalgic, but they were dormant. They weren't shared. And it was when the sort of series of feedback loops start happening. As people tell stories, they see themselves in print. Other people respond to their stories. People start to gather around stories. And the shops that sold the magazine also appeared in the magazine, and people started to realize, oh, these shops are kind of important to us. And a kind of a community rebuilding process happens in there. Community was perhaps there, but latent for a long time. And it tended to gather as people told more stories and they picked up themes to ask people about. It tended to gather around particular places. It might have been a school or a house of faith that isn't there anymore, but the site is important, or it might be what I think of as local luminaries. It could be the famous native son, but it also could be a favorite bartender or somebody who lives on the street who everybody knows, people who become gathering points. Or it could be reaching back to times of crisis that people shared. And these things then kind of build up an archive of shared memory and place awareness. Anyway, I watched that happen and felt like a neighborhood was being mapped in the process. And I think neighborhood and community are different here, and it's sort of important because neighborhood is about that placeness, about that realization of identification, shared identification with something in the streetscape or some place, and it's sort of always there to be discovered, and the stories we tell help us discover it. Community, this is obviously what Angela does so well, community has to be built. And I think it gets assumed much too much that if there's a place and there are a lot of people with common circumstances, there's community. But the very same place that could have felt like community at one time could feel like apartheid, not so much later on, when the sort of work of building and maintaining was no longer adequate to sort of shared survival there. So I'm just reflecting on how much these things transport around the globe. We're actively gathering stories in other cities in Asia right now, and some very marginal communities as well. And the stories, they might be ghost stories, they can be all sorts of stories, but they're stories that sort of conjure neighborhood, conjure place into being in a way that people can share. And I think that it's work that does build community towards the future. I'll stop.
Should I start with my question? Okay, perfect. So thank you. I saw so many connections across the 3 interventions. I really want to thank all of you. I think it's the conversation so far has created a good framework for the question I have in mind after thinking of your respective works and reading about many contributions by Angela, knowing the work of my colleagues Sherry and Jordan. So this is essentially a remark and a question that can go to the 3 of you. and I'm sure that each of you can contribute in a particular way. I'm thinking of Angela's initiatives that help people imagine sustainable and just cities by exploring narratives and solutions for change. We have seen that, on the other hand, imagination also brings to the foreground particular kinds of narratives, those that speak the language of aesthetics in particular. Art and cultural practices are central to the transformative solutions that you, Angela, devise in favor of equity, justice, and inclusivity. And in your Radical Imagination podcast series, you have drawn attention even more specifically to visionary futuristic fiction as a promoter of, how can I say, a communal spirit of improvement. For instance, I'm thinking of the voice, a very poignant voice of writer and activist Walida Imarisha that you have interviewed. I connected this to my own research on what is going on in the domain of philosophy and sociology right now. Many intellectuals have decreed the death of utopia as a mode of thinking. I'm thinking of Zygmunt Bauman, Massimo Cacciari in Italy, Fred Jameson here in the US, death of emancipatory grand narratives of the West, a gap between, let's say, power and politics, between the ability to do things and the insights into what needs to be done. Hence also the loss of faith in a future better world. It's as though the imagination could only resurrect the potentiality of the past. Sherry has mentioned many aspects of this as well. I'm thinking of Zygmunt Bauman's Retrotopia. So my question is this: do you think we can start approaching utopia under a new lens, for instance, no longer simply as wishful thinking, but rather as willful thinking, as a kind of intentional, forward-looking, moving force? And if literature and other creative expressions are considered utopian, in my view, they are so not because they suspend the political, but rather because as they construct new worlds, they are also interventional and performative. That is, they promote agency and change, going, how can I say, from potentiality to actuality. So, you know, I would welcome some comments about the role of utopia, art, and literature as subsets of these narratives that you have all presented for your respective work.
Well, I'd be happy to start. I think it was Octavia Butler who said that all change agents are science fiction thinkers. Visionary fiction certainly is what provides them with the capacity to be able to envision something that does not exist, but also something that you wouldn't expect to exist given where you are and where you've been. That's why I think that what you said really struck a positive tune for me, because I hadn't really thought about it that way before I heard someone else say it. Having been an organizer all my life, I just felt that I was in the business of trying to help people lean into their power and demand the society that they deserve, that we all deserve. It just has animated me always. And when someone said to me that that really is engaging in pursuing things that you only think about in the world of visionary fiction or science fiction or however you want to label it, I thought, well, I guess that's certainly true. That why is it that some of us just are so determined to create something that doesn't exist, to create justice and fairness? And so I think that it is both the combination of having an imagination that has been, we all have it, but having the good fortune to have your imagination unleashed, that is such good fortune. But to be able to combine that, which often comes from family and community, with a deep sense, a moral sense of justice and fairness. And then to find human beings to be able to move it into the context of movement. So I do think so. When you use the term utopia, I don't know that any of us ever think that we're striving for utopia, but what we're striving for is something better than what we have, that we think that we as human beings have the capacity to not just achieve on an individual basis, but on a broader scale as well.
Thank
So,
you.
I will jump in representing the literature side of all of this to say, first of all, that your question is interesting to me, Nicoletta, because so little of the work that I've read of the imaginative writing about the kinds of cities that I study, which are deindustrialized cities, very, very little of that is utopian. There is dystopian, futuristic work. But most of it is really about using the imagination, using aesthetics, using narrative to reimagine and understand the past and the relationship between past and present, often in the present. And some of it in ways that intervene almost literally on the landscape. So let me give a couple of very quick examples. Starting with, actually use 3 texts from Detroit, a city that is that could use a lot of utopia. One is Angela Flournoy's wonderful novel, The Turner House, which looks at the problem of gentrification and housing, foreclosures, as well as economic change and changes in class within one family, but weaves that together with a kind of ghost story. And looks at how the members of his family, something like 13 children, navigate the foreclosure of their mother's house on the east side of Detroit and deal with the relationships among themselves, as well as dealing with the ghosts left over from especially their father's experiences of the Great Migration and coming to Detroit to work in the auto industry and discovering that it was not the land of promise that he had been told that it would be. So that's one version where, through imagination and narrative, there's a retelling of the past that I think lets us see things about the future and about the present and the future that is useful. Another piece that I have read and written about and talked about is some of the work that Grace Lee Boggs, who's an amazing community organizer in Detroit, and Scott Kuroshige, who is no longer in Detroit, but they were working together on kind of imagining the future of Detroit. And they did it in a way largely, starting with like urban agriculture. And from there, imagining what would it be like to build a city that was an alternative economy, the kind of solidarity economy that Angela was talking about earlier, where it's from the ground up in many ways, quite literally, and saying, we see the potential here to challenge the capitalist structures, the racist structures that are holding us back. Here's what we think it looks like, and here's what we see on the ground right now that makes us think this is possible. So really making it concrete. The third example actually comes from a documentary called Detropia that is made by a Georgetown grad that in part focuses on artists, mostly young white, I'll use the hipster kind of label, moving to Detroit, taking advantage of the fact that there's a lot of cheap property in Detroit because of all of the larger issues going on there, to make Detroit the place for all kinds of artwork that is and is not about Detroit, that often largely ignores the presence of the people of Detroit, that uses it as a canvas and uses it as a space. Utopian, yes, in the sense of what could we do here? But not community building. And in fact, not paying attention to the nature of the community that is there. But again, creative, visionary, aesthetic, artistic, lots of potential, also problems. And I think this is true for all of these things. I don't know if the examples are helpful, but these are all the things that your question brought to mind.
Thank you. Fascinating. Once again, utopia connected to a specific place, going back to what Angela also was mentioning. So grounded in a specific context and acquiring significance because of that. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
May I chime in with a thought on, I'm very interested you brought up the concept of utopia, and then interested to hear Angela, I think, emphasizing the future-oriented narrative. And as Sherry suggested, we can see across past, present, and future the uses of utopia. But I was thinking about, I guess, what did you call it? Intentional utopia, and thinking of how often utopias reference something in the past, and often an imagined past. And I think some of the critique from Jameson and Bauman and so forth is gesturing toward that tendency in utopia, which itself is ancient, right? And it makes me think about architecture preservation as a sort of a utopian move in its own way too. And what I think we have to be careful about is that intentional utopia based on an imagined more perfect past is only one of any number of imagined pasts. And the question is whose utopia gets projected into the future, right? And so I think that because this has been my preoccupation in cities is the ways in which people kind of mark memory into their lived surroundings. I think that there really is always a utopian potential in believing that this represents who we really are and what we wanted to, what our original values were and so forth. That is so often at play in movements to preserve things, and yet at the same time, there's always going to be particular groups whose choices are privileged in this process. And I think, for example, we were with our group looking at other Asian cities. We were visiting communities in Jakarta. There are lots and lots of informal communities barely hanging on in places where the municipal authorities insist they don't belong. Of course, this is something Enrique knows well from many cities in Latin America as well. And somewhere along the way, this claim, right, that we built this place and it's ours. And the memories in this place are justification for our not being evicted, itself is a kind of utopian evocation of the past. It's not simply, I'm here, try, I won't move. It's, we've made this place and that gives it value. That often doesn't agree with much more powerful forces that are determining what should be projected into the future of that city's past. And yet it has its own, very interesting potential as a form of urbanism, the self-built community, the community that has survives really not on the basis of anything of sort of grand monumental significance, but because the people made it.
I wanted to just add one more thing. Walida Imarisha, who's the person I did the interview with for the podcast, has put together an edited volume called Octavia's Brood, in which she actually asked social activists to write science fiction. And they did a wonderful job. I mean, a couple of them were writers, but most of them were, in fact, organizing in communities and pulling out of their experiences. It's really fascinating. I recommend it.
This is so wonderful. Thank you again to everyone. What I would like to do is build on this exciting focus already on imagination as part of storytelling, and ask kind of a basic question about the agency associated with storytelling, and especially the agency associated with the act of imagination. It's easy for us, I think, to associate that practice, if you will, with an artist, or maybe a public official, or Jordan, maybe an architect. But it seems to me that the amount of change that local communities will experience is so great that it requires community-based imagination. And I'm wondering if everyone could reflect a little bit on where the agency comes from to engage in that practice.
Well, that's a good question. I have to think about it. As I've seen it emerge, and the thing that you have conjured for me with the question is sitting in community meetings. And I've sat in hundreds of them. And my children say they sat in thousands of them. That's what you do. But you almost can see it happening in real time. It's when you create a space in which you invite and encourage and validate people's experiences. Because we all end each day carrying 1,000 stories with us. But it takes someone pulling it out of you, coming to you and talking about your wisdom and saying what they've seen you do. I mean, to talk about somebody who actually is the person who makes sure that the block is safe, that never really thinks of themselves as having a special role. But when you go to them and sit on their stoop and say, I came to talk to you about the young people who seem not to have enough to do, because you seem to know all of them. And as they begin to talk and tell you about so-and-so and so-and-so who they've seen grow up, they begin to see themselves in a different light and to feel their power and capacity. And suddenly their experiences take on new meaning, new value, and they become the vessels for being able to bring forward all of that. And that becomes agency. They become agents. And as you begin to connect their capacity to bring an asset to a future that clearly we know we both want, because we've just been sitting here describing it, their agency gets activated. So that's where I've seen it most.
I would absolutely echo that. And I think we invite stories. Stories happen when we invite them. They get shared when we invite them. They get shared when we either create structures in which people can tell stories, or we and I want to talk a little bit about the role of organizers, but we see that person on the block and know to go ask them. I'm thinking about two experiences I had in my work in Youngstown. One was a large oral history project that we did where almost every person we sat down with, the first thing they said to us is, well, I don't really have anything important to tell you. And then we spent an hour and a half and got amazing stories about them and their neighborhoods and their families and their work. And it was because we had used the power we had as academics, the positionality we had, to go out and ask. And it mattered in part that we could say to people, we're with the university. I mean, there are times when you can deploy the power you have to create opportunities for that. The other thing I'm thinking of is a project that I helped run that created sort of story circles around experiences of race in Youngstown, where we gathered at a local church. We had people come from a number of different churches, and we created a structure that said, everybody at this table, 3 or 4 or 5 people, we're going to ask you each to tell a story. And there is a power in that sharing of stories and hearing stories together. But it was important that people were invited. This was a Christian community that we were tapping into. We invited people to a church. The invitation came in part from their pastor. They came and they saw other people that they knew, even if they weren't at a table with those people. And those of us who were leading the discussion told our stories too. So we were able to create a structure that facilitated that storytelling, not only by saying, we think the thing you have to tell us is important, but also we're going to have an exchange. And we're all here because we care about this larger thing. And I think those kinds of things really make a difference.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I was going to say it starts with charismatic activists like Angela, but I'm actually going to correct myself because I think that's important. But I think there are charismatic activists who are not necessarily good listeners out there. They're good at, say, bringing in a big grant and delivering a lot of, exciting ideas, but not knowing how to really just sit down and hear what's being said to them. And that's it's a different talent set, skill set, or whatever, I think. And so I would correct myself to say that what Uwe's looking for, I think that kind of community-based imagination, which is kind of a moving, changing thing. It can't be, brought in by one person, but it does depend on charismatic listeners, which means somebody who comes and really knows how to care and knows how to listen and how to make people sort of create what I was calling feedback loops among people's narratives. So there are individual agents always involved here. I don't think it doesn't happen just by osmosis. It happens by individuals, but they're equally, and Sherry, I think, is exemplifying this too, listening individuals.
This segues into a really interesting question from the audience, and I encourage other members of the audience, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A. So let me read this question from Paul Geist. Yes, there can be the power of positive thinking and imaginative thought of what can be, but major roadblocks and that are deliberate and powerful do also exist. Look at what is happening today around the issue of voting rights in so many states. How does one prepare, fight, and guard against those who have as their mission to disallow any other narrative than the one that they want to have or want to have in place?
I stumble on the disallow because once I was talking to an employee who had been offended by something that I had said, and she was telling me how she felt about it. And my immediate response, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Quickly going on to what I intended, she said, you can't tell me what I feel. He said, we can have this conversation, but it can't start with you telling me what I feel. And I was really caught in that because it was just so true. And she was so definite about how she said it. We ended up having a different conversation. It came to a good end because there was a story I had to tell about how I felt. So I don't want to start by disallowing anybody's story because it is what they feel, how they've interpreted their experience. And it's almost that you need to try to get that, no matter how ugly it might be, so that you can, even if you can't get them to tell a different story, you and your colleagues can have an understanding of what it is that they are experiencing that causes them to act the way that they're acting, which doesn't mean that I have to accept the way they're acting or I have to even take as legitimate the story that they're telling themselves, but it helps to be able to have a story that is as powerful when it is confronted by that story, that it can attract more people to it. I think that's partially what we are trying to do right now in this moment in the United States. that there is a wonderful story to tell about the future that we would have if we embraced what it is that we are becoming, which is this multiracial, multicultural nation. What could be more positive in a global economy than to live in a world nation in which the people are connected to the globe through kinship, through language, through custom? And we have to begin to tell that story with power, with positive outcomes, with an invitation to join and experience it. And the more powerfully we can create an imagery and outcomes associated with that, the more it will quiet and marginalize another story, which also has a lot of power behind it at the moment. So I think that's the answer to your question. I just wanted to edit out the disallow. I don't want to act as if people's experiences aren't real for them.
I'd like to expand that we've had a quick follow-up in the Q&A here, and bridge the question out of the community-based context and into the intersection between community and systems. The addendum to the question reads, how do you change those Goliath systems that are entrenched by the most powerful with the rocks of David? Those of us who, with the least power, position, place, and the fewest rocks. And I do think that this is a very interesting question because of that interconnection between what we might define as local community and the broader and underlying systems associated with, especially in a practical sense, a city. Anyone want to take that one?
So I just want to echo what Angela said before, which is that when those people who don't have power get together and tell their stories, they create power together. They create the ability to push back on those things. If we say about those, the larger institutional structures that are blocking change, that we have to dismantle those before we can do anything, I think we're in trouble. What we have to be able to do is get people together to fight back against those, to intervene in them, and to activate the power that they have. And that might mean small victories for a while. It might mean local victories that maybe over time ripple out. I mean, the question began with asking about voting rights, and I'm thinking about the story of Georgia over the last few years, much of which was about community organizing and people sharing their stories. And then that grew and it spread and changed, and we saw the outcome. It's in part about saying, I don't buy the idea that those larger institutions are immutable. I believe that if we come together, we can find ways to fight back. You're not going to overthrow it instantly, but I think that it does get rooted in stories because that's the tool to bring people together.
I also think that what we're experiencing right now is just such a powerful example of narrative and emergence of new seats of power. I mean, we're in an ugly period in the United States of America. There is no question about it, but there's also no question that a positive change is underway, which is precisely why we're in such an ugly period. You have people who are trying to hold on to a past that was exclusive, that marginalized people, that operated on a hierarchy of human value that was perpetuating the story of white people being of more value than people who were not white. And that is tumbling so fast that people are literally in the last gasp of that kind of white supremacy. Now, a last gasp can be long and shrill and dangerous. And that is what we are experiencing. But make no mistake, it is last. And what will emerge out of this is dependent on how we get through this period. But something else is emerging. And the thing that is causing so much pain is going away. And this is because of narrative, it is because of agency, it is because of power shifting, it is because that the story that people are telling themselves about a future that is inclusive and diverse is more powerful than the story that people had been telling themselves about what they felt could never be changed. It changed. It has already changed. What are we going to do with the change is the question that we face.
I think this is such an interesting way that, as Angela's just described it, that narrative is poised in a sense against structure. I mean, there are no questions that there are these big structures in which we are all embedded in some way, whether it's capitalism or racial dominance, what have you. We can't ignore these things if we're interested in social progress. But things actually never repeat just the way they always were. They always are evolving, and that's the nature of narrative. We tell new stories, and the stories actually motivate us to behave in new ways, and the grassroots changes then become sea changes at a larger scale. I mean, just to project it, not that I know this city intimately, but I've been watching the news very closely from Yangon recently in Myanmar, as you know, Uwe. I was there a few years ago, and there's a member of our team who works very closely with people on the ground there. They're facing, you know, people in the streets, kids in the street are facing off against military using live fire right now. And it's terrifying. And it's very easy to think in structures and think, you know, the levels of oppression and military dominance in that society so huge, they could go right back to, you know, before 1988, and everybody remembers the last big crackdown and massacres and so forth. And yet at the same time, you can tell they're not in the same place, because the people at the front lines, they have a new story for themselves. And it carries the memory of what happened last time, but they're determined that they're not just permanently under those structures. And that doesn't mean we're guaranteed of, you know, how long it'll be before they're out from under. There's no knowing, as Angela was suggesting, that the last cry could be a very long, painful one. But, you know, when you tell new stories, it moves you forward. It doesn't repeat over and over again what's happened in the past. So,
Angela, I have a quick question for you that I'll ask, and then we will wrap up. So Angela, this is a combination of two questions that have been asked. As you know, there is a practice and a theory that is being called design thinking, that is very much alive at Georgetown as a concept, and even as a practice. And the question is really around the use of storytelling and maybe the engagement of storytelling as a tool of governmental processes. And there's a question here specifically associated with, you know, urban planning processes, and you could imagine that at a neighborhood scale. But I guess, does government have the authenticity and the agency to use storytelling in the processes that it goes through to do its work?
Sure, it does at many levels. One of the ways that it's really just fascinating in local communities to watch is participatory budgeting. As communities come together and think about what the budget is, that is so much imagination and storytelling and agency all wrapped into one. So yes, that is a wonderful thing to look at. It continues to be small. It's not at scale yet, but it's extraordinary to see. One of the things that's happening in Oakland, California right now, and PolicyLink where I'm the founder in residence, is very much a part of this, is the community is reimagining policing. And it really is extraordinary to see people coming together, talking about exactly what they want it to be, and all of the tensions you would think are there. They are there. But at the same time, budgets are changing because people are coming together and telling their stories about what their experiences have been and their aspirations in terms of what they want for community. Absolutely, yes.
Wonderful. So we have a quick round of final reflections. Jordan, I'll start with you and then I'll move to Sherry. Caught you off guard there.
Completely off guard. What to say? I'm inspired. I mean, yeah. Obviously, there are many issues that are special to our present moment in the United States, and I don't want to run everything together into the same kind of mush. But I do feel like I've learned from Angela and Sherry as well today, and just think that we should be carrying stories across borders as well, and learning from one another's communities.
Sherry?
Yeah, Jordan, I would actually say the same thing. I think one of the things that's most valuable about conversations like this is that they give us opportunities. You know, I was talking before about scale, about moving from the level of stories of individuals and communities to the kind of comparative, broader understanding that we get when we have these conversations together. I think it's important for us to do this. So I found it really inspiring and enjoyable, and about the most positive thing I've heard recently. So thank you all.
Thank you for including me. This was really just scratching the surface. It felt like more. My pleasure to be with you.
And thank you so much, Angela, for being with us here today and for this entire year. Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to thank everyone and give Nicoletta the last word.
Wow, big responsibility. Well, on behalf of all of us, I really wish to thank our speakers for a truly inspiring conversation. Their observations have brought to the foreground the urgent need for institutional change, but have also allowed us to appreciate the potential of cities as promoters of inclusive innovation. Cities are multi-layered and overdetermined spaces. They are sites of shared memories, we have seen from several of the interventions, where the heritage of the past infuses the experience of a collective present and the conceptualization of its future. But there are also non-spaces of transience and anonymity, locations that cannot be ascribed the affective denomination of places, because human relations are often marred by profound inequities, neglect, and alienation. We have seen it also in the Q&A. For their part, our speakers have shown us creative approaches that can foster awareness and emotional attachment, and that can transcend polarizations through place-based engagements and learning communities. While I was preparing for this event, I kept thinking of one of the characters in the novel Invisible Cities by the Italian writer Italo Calvino, who says, "You take delight not in a city's 7 or 70 wonders, but in the answer it gives to a question of yours." Well, tonight's conversation has eloquently demonstrated that a city, like a person, has conflicting stories to tell, multiple answers to give, and many outstanding queries that demand equitable responses. A city is a reservoir of possibilities, and through imagination and cooperation, we have learned that it can lead us forward. It can help us overcome its many stumbling blocks and turn them into opportunities for reparation and renewal. So thank you again to our speakers. Thanks to the audience for being with us, and good night.